Teddy Roosevelt. But the Progressive Era did not begin happily. On September 16, 1901, a gunshot rang out at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. The shooter was Leon Czolgosz. The victim, President William McKinley. Czolgosz had approached the president at the fair with a pistol hidden beneath a handkerchief and shot him twice in the stomach. Czolgosz was a political radical who had lost his job and thought McKinley was a tyrant. McKinley would linger for several days before dying of an infection from his wounds. As for Czolgosz, he would be executed the following month. America mourned the loss of President McKinley. He had been a warm, fatherly sort of president that had guided the United States through the Spanish-American War and into a decade of prosperity. McKinley was succeeded by Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, the hero of San Juan Hill. After the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt had become the first governor of New York and then vice president to McKinley. Never expecting McKinley to die in office, Roosevelt was hiking in the mountains in New York when McKinley died. Theodore Roosevelt hurried back from his vacation to become the 26th President of the United States. Theodore Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest person to ever become president, only 42 when he assumed office. As a young man, he was frail and suffered from asthma. But growing up, Teddy Roosevelt had overcome his physical weaknesses by rigorous exercise. Roosevelt would be a driving force of progressive change. He was a man of grand ideas and boundless energy, equally at home hiking and hunting as he was attending to the duties of state. Under the command of the bold young Roosevelt, the United States ventured into the 20th century. One of the big problems of the early 20th century was the poor working conditions brought about by the rapid industrialization of the nation. American workers had enough of the low pay, the dirty working conditions, and the long, grueling hours. They banded together into organizations called unions. A union is an association of workers who band together to negotiate better working conditions from their employer. They get their power from their numbers, meaning one worker can't demand more pay or better working conditions on their own, but if all the workers demand it, the employer is put into a bind. When an employer refused to negotiate with a union, the union might use something called a strike. A strike is when workers refuse to work, usually as a means of protest to pressure an employer to negotiate. Early strikes could be violent, as factory owners often hired armed thugs to attack the unions. Sometimes the unions themselves could become violent. At the 1892 Homestead strike in Pennsylvania, unions protesting against working conditions in one of Andrew Carnegie's steel mills were threatened by armed attackers hired by the steel mill. But then, the union itself turned and attacked the armed thugs, beating them and taking them prisoner as if it were a battle. Teddy Roosevelt and the Progressives sympathized with the cause of the unions. Throughout the Progressive Era, laws were passed that bettered working conditions, but friction between unions and employers would go on for many more decades. Another way the Progressives tried to protect Americans from what they perceived as the corrupting influence of huge companies, like Rockefeller's Standard Oil, was by passing several laws against monopolies. Do you remember what a monopoly is? We learned about it in Chapter 23. A monopoly is when a company controls so much of an industry that they have an unfair advantage over other companies. After the passage of these laws, it was more difficult for men like John D. Rockefeller to control the entirety of a single industry. In fact, in 1911, the Supreme Court said that Standard Oil was too big and ordered the company to be broken up into 34 smaller companies. Never again would men like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and the robber barons be able to control so much power. One interesting story about President Teddy Roosevelt is that the teddy bear is named after him. This goes back to the time President Roosevelt was invited to go hunting with the governor of Mississippi in 1902. President Theodore Roosevelt huffed, sitting down on a log to rest. One of his aides, Holt Collier, plopped down on the ground beside the president, dropping a clanking assortment of bags, pots, and equipment. "To think, we are days out in this Mississippi wilderness, and no big game to be seen," exclaimed President Roosevelt. "The day is still young, Mr. President," replied Holt Collier. "I'm sure you'll find your prize." "I should hope so," snorted the president. "Everyone else on this expedition has already shot something. If I can't bag a kill by today, I'm going to be made to look the fool in front of the governor." Holt Collier began to think. An idea crept into his head. "Mr. President," he stammered, "why don't you rest a while here? I'm going to go, conversate with some of the other gentlemen of the expedition." The president waved Collier away dismissively, his eyebrows furrowed while he thought angrily about his lack of a kill. "Schmidt, Wallace, and even Governor Longino have all had kills," he said to himself. After a while, Collier returned, running up the path, waving his hat in his hand. "Come quickly, Mr. President. Grab your rifle. We've spotted a black bear, and it's a beauty." "That's what I like to hear," cheered Roosevelt, grabbing his rifle and leaping to his feet. "Show me the beast, Collier. My blood is hot for the thrill of the hunt." "This way, sir." Collier led President Roosevelt up the path. Roosevelt trotted behind briskly, loading his rifle as he moved. A few moments later, Holt Collier led him into a clearing. Other members of the hunting party stood about, smiling, but Roosevelt did not smile. His grin turned to a frown, and his mustache twitched. "There's your bear, Mr. President," announced Collier proudly. At the far side of the clearing, a small black bear was tied to the trunk of a willow tree. It was lying down, whimpering. Its head looked bloodied and beaten. Roosevelt glowered at Collier. "Well, we had to club it a bit to get it tied to the tree," stammered Collier. "What are you waiting for?" bellowed another. "Take the shot!" President Roosevelt lowered his rifle and shook his head. "No, sir. No, sir, I will not. It's unsportsmanlike to shoot a creature in such straits. I'd be ashamed, gentlemen." Word of Teddy Roosevelt's compassion spread far and wide as newspaper cartoonists published drawings of the event. Not long after, a New York toymaker named Morris Mictum handmade a stuffed bear and put it in the window of his store, labeling it Teddy's Bear. The bear toy went on to become very popular. Mictum wrote President Roosevelt and asked his permission to call the new doll a teddy bear, and Roosevelt enthusiastically agreed. And that's how the teddy bear was born.